Welcome to our program. On behalf of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland's College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, it's my pleasure to warmly welcome all of you and our distinguished speakers today. I'm Professor Hoda Mahmoudi, the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. You may not know that one of the themes that we regularly learn more about through scholarly work, such as those of today's speakers, is about empowerment of women and peace, because we feel that the equality of women is one of the barriers to a more peaceful world. And so topics like today help us to understand better some of these barriers. So today's talk addresses the growing influence of algorithmically amplified male supremacist and anti-feminist content on short-form video platforms such as TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Influencers who blend reactionary ideology with self-help branding have gained significant traction among young men, raising concerns about how digital platforms may be shaping beliefs, identities, and political attitudes. This topic matters because the content young people encounter online doesn't just entertain, it shapes how they see themselves, others, and the world. Understanding how algorithms amplify certain messages helps us to see the hidden ways digital platforms can influence beliefs, identities, and even political attitudes. By paying attention, we can better equip young people and people everywhere, educators and policymakers, to respond thoughtfully. So this session will invite reflections on how researchers, educators, and institutions can respond to these emerging challenges. So it's really a great pleasure for me today to introduce our two speakers. Professor Debbie Ging is a professor of digital media and gender in the School of Communications at Dublin City University and the director of the DCU Institute for Research and Gender and Sexuality. Professor Ging's research focuses on gender, sexuality, and digital media, with particular attention to digital hate, online anti-feminist, men's rights politics, the incel subculture, and the radicalization of boys and men into male supremacist ideologies. Her work also addresses young people's experiences of gender-based and sexual abuse online, as well as educational interventions designed to prevent and respond to these harms. She is internationally recognized for her scholarship on the digital atmosphere and the gendered dynamics of online radicalization. Also with us today is Dr. Catherine Baker. We are also delighted to welcome her. She is a Research Ireland postdoctoral fellow with the Institute for Research on Genders and Sexualities at the Dublin City University and a fellow with the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. Dr. Baker holds a PhD in Media and Communications from Loughborough University's Online Civic Center. Her research interests include online misogyny, digital platforms, masculinities, educational interventions, algorithms, policies, politics, pseudoscience, and anti-gender movements. Her work brings a critical interdisciplinary perspective to understanding how digital systems, ideologies, and cultures intersect in shaping contemporary gender politics. It is with great pleasure that I welcome both of you. And I think that Professor Ging, you will be going first.
That's right. I'm going to kick off and give a background introduction to the emerging trends within the manosphere, just to set the scene. And then Catherine will take over and explain in more detail the rationale behind our study and our methodology and findings. So I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about the manosphere, which, as most people probably know already, is a diverse ecosystem of online anti-feminist and male supremacist groups. And it has been attracting quite a lot of academic attention for well over a decade, but really it's only quite recently that it has entered mainstream public debates. If we go to the first mapping of the manosphere, next slide, please, Catherine. I did this research. I started this research in 2016, so um, 10 years ago. Um, and it was one of the first qualitative mappings of the manosphere ecosystem that looked at the different subgroups and their different kinds of beliefs and rhetorical and communicative strategies and core concerns. And you can see here from the groups that I identified, the key groups back then were men's rights activists who are, the kind of the red pillars, if you like, of the manosphere, the red pill being the core unifying ideology, if you like, of this ecosystem, which is based on the idea that mainstream society is a kind of a gynocentric conspiracy or a feminist liberal conspiracy. And that to take the red pill is to be awakened to this. So we hear this pilling terminology in alt-right and far-right circles as well, and it has become increasingly mainstreamed and kind of normalized in popular discourse. MGTOWs, which are men going their own way, kind of male separatists who wanted nothing to do with women, or at least nothing to do with Western women, because they're perceived as being, overly contaminated by feminism, pickup artists, or seduction coaches, dating coaches, the more kind of commercial end of the earlier manosphere, who are making a lot of money out of teaching men seduction, very questionable and oftentimes bordering on kind of abusive seduction strategies. Traditional conservatives or tradcons, who would have been the more kind of Republican, if we're looking at American politics, because a lot of these ideas come originally from the United States. Traditional conservative, Republican, pro-gun lobby, anti-abortion, Christian end of the manosphere, and then incels or involuntary celibates, which, again, as most people probably know, are a quite a subcultural subgroup, quite a niche subgroup of the manosphere of men who don't have access to the sex that they feel they are entitled to and are quite bitter, but also quite self-loathing. So those were the core kinds of groups of the manosphere back then. And one of the most significant things that has happened, if we move on there to the next slide, is the I suppose the migration or the trajectory of the manosphere from its origins here on message boards like 4chan and various subreddits. It began as a very niche kind of subculture. It wasn't in any way commercialized. It was, very much a kind of a, a subculture, an in-group, that was in many ways an early manifestation of the culture wars. But what we did start seeing then was the kind of rhetorical tactics of the culture wars emerging and their use of technology. And in this way, their use of technology to target individual women, to harass women, to dox women or put their details online, to organize kind of orchestrated campaigns on individual women in gaming, for example, which was, when Gamergate blew up in 2014. And in many ways, this use of technology to harass and humiliate women and to abuse women was a precursor of what was to come and what we're seeing now with the proliferation of image-based sexual abuse, non-consensual intimate image generation technologies like notification technologies with the recent Grok scandal, etc. So this is kind of a very ramped up version of what was going on back then. But the mainstream of the manosphere, which is the context in which we are giving this presentation today, didn't really happen overnight. Um, it has been fomenting, if you like, over the past 10 years through various channels. And next slide, please. If we go back to even, the 90s, we see the mainstreaming and commercialization of, already pickup artists already back then. If we look at various other platforms. Next slide, please, Catherine. Like Urban Dictionary, we see that these kinds of ostensibly quite innocuous platforms were already doing quite a lot of mainstreaming work during this period. So it has been quite a gradual process. If we look at YouTube and the likes of Jordan Peterson, next slide, please. He in particular has been using YouTube to warm people up to ideas from evolutionary psychology that, effectively underpin most, if not all, manosphere thinking. So this has been happening for quite some time. And in addition to, to these online groups and individuals and phenomena, you have a kind of broader constellation of economic, political, technological, and sociocultural factors that have, contributed to the commercialization and mainstreaming of the manosphere, and also to its amplification. Its reach, its size have grown significantly in the past 10 years. And what was really the kind of catalyst or the tipping point was the introduction of, or the emergence of new short form platforms during COVID. So, namely TikTok and YouTube Shorts. But it's a kind of perfect storm. You had these new platforms emerge during the COVID pandemic, but you also have that playing into a wider context of anxiety and disenfranchisement wrought by neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, and political shifts to the right. So this kind of, we'd seen already political interference via algorithmic polarization and disinformation already back in 2016, the subsequent rise of strongman politics in the United States and elsewhere. But then this kind of in turn reinforced the polarization that we see in the manosphere and the far right. And then in Trump's second term, we saw a very clear rightward shift of the tech oligarchs. They made it quite clear where their loyalties lay. So now we have this coalescence, if you like, of strongman politicians, tech elites, and male supremacist and far right influencers, which is this, perfect kind of storm or imperfect storm. Carol Cadwallader, the journalist, has called it, loosely names this the broligarchy. Yanis Varoufakis calls it a new age of techno-feudalism. So that's kind of the broader socio-political, economic, technological context in which all of this has become possible. Next slide, please. And so just last year, with some colleagues that I'm working with in Australia, on a project funded by the Australian Research Council, we decided to do a new mapping or a remapping of the neo-manospheres, which seemed to be the more appropriate term now because so much has changed and also because they've become much more fluid, much more dynamic, much more multiple, much more diverse. And so we found that many of the same groups were still there. The men going their own way, or the MGTOWs, have kind of reduced in size. The incel community has grown. It has become more extreme in many ways. But the key difference is the transition to influencer culture. And again, this is facilitated by platforms like TikTok and YouTube Shorts, but also by the wider shift towards the influencer economy. And that really is the key difference. It has become a hugely commercialized and monetized ecosystem. We see as well new communities like anti-masturbation, or also known as semen retention communities. These link in, that's what NoFap is. These link in with you kind of health and wellness concerns, tap into the wellness industry. We see this huge focus on stoicism, but it's a form of stoicism that has been sold to men. Alex Hamo refers to this as the Stoic industrial complex. We see increasing ethnic and ideological diversification within the manosphere with the emergence of the Black manosphere. And we see the involvement of women in the form of tradwives, both the more kind of commercial influencer type tradwives who are peddling a traditional subservient housewife lifestyle, but also the more politicized ones like Hannah Pearl Davis, who are very overtly part of the politics of the manosphere. So that we noted that there are four key changes: migration to new platforms, commercialization or monetization, diversification, and overlap with other extreme ideologies. And I'll just go through those very briefly. As I say, the kind of the commercialization and monetization of the manosphere has been largely facilitated by algorithms and the rise of influencer culture. And we've seen then the I suppose the almost inevitable emergence of manfluencers, masculinity influencers, male supremacist influencers, whatever you want to call them. What we've noticed though as well, and we noticed this already in our project, our study in 2024, 2023, when we were actually doing the research, was, with the exception of Andrew Tate, and even to some extent, some of Andrew Tate's content, was that they were dialing back deliberately and strategically dialing back the really overt misogyny, number one, to avoid being deplatformed, but also because they realized that you can tap into male insecurities in much more strategic ways to do with concern about the economy, anxiety about the future, men's anxieties about their looks, through various different channels like money-making advice, influencers. These have become, the kind of the new channels through which they're reaching boys and men. Fitness advice, diet advice, nutrition, mental health is the other kind of arm of this, if you like. And all of that together makes up what Hamo calls the Stoic industrial complex. We've also seen, as I say, ideological and ethnic diversification, much of which is quite difficult to make sense of. You've got the female anti-feminists, the tradwives, ethnic diversity, the emergence of the Black manosphere in figures like Myron Gaines and Walter Weeks, who are hosts of the Fresh and Fit podcast. Hamza, a Black manfluencer in the UK, and then the emergence of Black tradwives as well. So it's becoming this kind of increasingly difficult to understand space, and in some ways, I think the confusion is part of the project, because it's constant distraction, constant conflict. In terms of the content. So you have the likes of Andrew Tate converting to Islam, for example, and Sneeko, another manfluencer, converting to Islam. And much of this is in a bid, obviously, just to reach new markets. Andrew Tate is now passé. Very few boys and young men are being served his content now, there's a whole new raft of influencers who've taken over, who kind of emulate his business model, but dial back on some of the more kind of overt misogyny. So they are having a huge reach. We know this from the work that we do, going out to schools, doing workshops and focus groups and talking to teenage boys, that they are being served huge amounts of this kind of content. They're also being served a huge amount of American political content. They're seeing a lot of Charlie Kirk, they're seeing a lot of Nick Fuentes, they're seeing a lot of Ben Shapiro in their feeds. And, one of the most confounding things, I suppose, for us is, how do they make sense of that? How do they feel about the fact that they're being recommended this kind of content? They're Irish teenagers, and yet this is their daily feed, kind of 24/7, is this kind of content. So we've had some very interesting conversations with teenage boys recently about this. Next slide, please. Okay, so just by way of example, this is the kind of content now that we're talking about. Catherine, if you want to play those videos. Can you hear the sound?
No,
I can't hear the sound.
no, we can't hear.
I don't give a fuck what anybody says. If a girl is your girlfriend, she is your main woman, and she's advertising her body on the internet for other men to look at, that is fucking cheating.
It's the mastery of your own emotions and the necessity and the desire to do what's needed to be done, even if it goes against your instincts. The willingness to fight is more important than the ability to fight. You would rather have an untrained man who can't fight be happy to go downstairs and face the burglars with his wife upstairs than a jiu-jitsu expert.
We're in a society where women speak with authority over men without the skills to back it up. In a way, men are modern day slaves because no matter what they do, women rob them. They get a lower paycheck in corporate America and have to do the woman's work. Men get robbed in divorce if they fail in love. Men get robbed through their taxes.
Okay, next slide, please.
I don't give a fuck.
So this is the kind of very targeted messaging that boys and young men are receiving, and part of the issue is that it's not, it's borderline content. It's not content that the platforms need to take down necessarily. Some of it is, but most of it is borderline and is within their community guidelines. The problem is the proliferation, the constant kind of fire hosing of this messaging and how reinforced it becomes. It's targeted, it's short form, and it's being repeated constantly to them. So we're seeing this messaging being reflected back to us in classrooms when we go out to talk to younger boys, particularly about control, that women should be submissive, they should obey their husbands, and that is the husband's role to provide for women and to be the breadwinner. These guys are 15. They don't have jobs, and they're already in a kind of imaginary future where they're heterosexual, they're married, they have kids, and they're earning money. It really is, it's quite alarming. So, why does it matter? What's the problem? It's probably self-evident why this matters at this point, but like you cannot really overemphasize how popular or how invasive this messaging is among young men. And obviously how aggressive the algorithmic amplification of this messaging is, which is what Catherine's going to talk about in the specific context of our study. We're also seeing reports from teachers about the concerning rise of misogyny in the classroom. Stephanie Westcott, Steve Roberts have been really great on this research in Australia. We're very quick to go out and talk to teachers about the changing culture and the changing mood within Australian schools, specifically because of this. We're also seeing research that shows us that men who are exposed to this type of content are becoming more likely to mistrust and dehumanize women. And we're seeing a gender gap in terms of support for gender equality among young people. So, a really, really gendered gap in political views. This came out in the Global Institute for Women's Leadership report last year, but it is also even more prevalent in the recent Ipsos study. I don't know if people have seen that yet, which is showing that 1/3 of Gen Z men believe in these very antiquated notions that women should obey their husbands, men should be breadwinners, etc. So we're seeing for the first time in, I suppose, modernity, younger men, teenagers and younger men, Gen Z, exhibiting very clearly more reactionary, more conservative viewpoints than older generations of men. It's the first time that this has ever happened. And the gap, the link between this and the manosphere messaging, I think, is fairly clear. Not just the manosphere, kind of the broader political context. It's not just coming from the manosphere, it's coming from, other kind of political spaces as well. But social media is clearly the link here. At the same time, we're seeing girls and women veering more to the left and to liberal political thinking. But we're also seeing an increase, and I think this is also for the first time, in intimate partner violence among younger generations of women. So Gen Z girls and women are more likely to experience intimate partner violence than older generations of women. So these are very stark statistics, and these are very large-scale studies, which are showing the impact of this polarization and disinformation on a particular generation that is heavily exposed to social media. Next slide. Okay, so that's me. I'm going to hand over to Catherine now to give you the details of our study. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a second. Yes, thank you, Debbie, for that. I'm going to take over now to talk us through a research project that we carried out in 2023 and published in 2024, tracking the role of recommender algorithms on TikTok and YouTube Shorts and their role in promoting manosphere content. This is going to be overlapping with a lot of the discussions that Debbie brought up, and kind of providing some empirical evidence of this kind of shift and mainstreaming in the manosphere, looking at the different kind of influencer cultures and content promoted, but particularly looking at the role of recommender algorithms on social media platforms in mainstreaming this content into the social media feeds of boys and young men. So this report was authored by myself, Debbie, and a colleague, Maya Brandt Andreasen, who had all been working on the manosphere for several years before this and had started to witness this shift in what the manosphere content was looking like from these niche online communities, which you had to seek out to find, into something that seemed to be coming into the feeds of young people. It was increasingly being reported to us by young people, teachers, and such, that this was becoming much more prevalent in discussions around classrooms and young people. And this seemed to, at the time, be coming out of both COVID and the increased popularity of short form video platforms such as TikTok and YouTube Shorts, and the increasing prominence of recommender algorithms in the structure of popular social media platforms. So we sought out to do an experimental research project looking at different types of male users of these platforms and looking at the type of content that was recommended to them. We based our methodology in collaboration with a research organisation in Australia called Reset Australia, who had previously carried out a project similar in the Australian context, only on YouTube Shorts. So we adapted their methodology for both an Irish context and to extend this to research on both YouTube Shorts, but also TikTok, as this is the social media platform that is most popular among young people. And this was a short experimental research project in that we bought 10 iPhones, blank iPhones, and we set them up with different types of user accounts. So we had half of our phones looking at TikTok and half at YouTube Shorts. And for each phone, we set up 5 user profiles. So 2 age 16 and 2 age 18. For each age, we had a user who was interested in what we called manosphere curious. So a user who was interested in kind of maybe seeking out some manosphere content. And the second type of account was users that sought out kind of gender stereotypical content that we thought would be representative of teenage boys. So gym content, video game content, comedy content, and so on. In addition to this, we also created a blank account, a control account for each of these users who do not engage with specific types of content. And our methodology was very hands-on. We actually sat down with the phones and scrolled through their For You page of these phones. We would scroll through 50 videos. We would then go to the search bar and search out one of our prompts. So this was kind of to signal to the algorithm the kind of content that we were interested in. For the manosphere content, again, this was things like Andrew Tate. However, for the kind of gender normative accounts, this was things like video games and gym content. We would then go back to the FYP, scroll through 50 more videos, and if anything related to manosphere content came up, we would watch it through. And we continued doing this for 300 videos per phone. Meanwhile, we were screen recording the content so we could go back and look at it later. In the moment, it was a very kind of fast process. If anyone is on YouTube or YouTube Shorts or TikTok, you know, it's kind of a fast process. So after we had carried this out, we went back and we watched these videos and we coded the kind of prominent themes that were emerging among the content so that we could track both what kind of content, but then also how it was increasing over time. And our 4 prominent themes that we developed were alpha masculinity, misogyny or anti-feminism, reactionary right-wing content, conspiracy content, and then we mapped how these increased over time to look at the differences between the user behavior, the ages, and also the platforms. So I will run you through our findings now. So first of all, looking at YouTube Shorts. So for our, this diagram is an amalgamation of the 4 users. So each of these lines represents one of the phones with all those 4 themes kind of added up across the rounds. So every 50 videos. So interestingly, for every phone was recommended this type of content, one of those 4 codes, and a combination of all of them. whether they sought out manosphere content or just stereotypical kind of gender normative content. And once this content was engaged with, it rapidly increased. So for YouTube Shorts, 61.5% of the content recommended to the experimental accounts contained this type of content. And for YouTube Shorts, accounts were mostly recommended manosphere content. So of this recommended content, 56% of the 61%, 56% was manosphere related. So the phones that went on looking for manosphere content or didn't were recommended a lot of manosphere content. We also took note of the most common hashtags to kind of see the way in which these videos were being promoted into the For You page. And what was very interesting, and this will overlap a lot with what Debbie was saying, and one of our major findings from the research was this centrality of masculinity content within the content. We when we're going into it, probably expecting a higher amount of misogyny and anti-feminism, and that was there for sure. But the overwhelming amount of content was focused on kind of masculinity, tips to be a man, and so on, very much around kind of a self-help model that was used to promote kind of rigid control of emotions and regressive forms of masculinity. So you can see here how this was kind of also used to attract the kind of the user. So we have motivation, success, mindset, the way in which is kind of promoted to users as self-help content. We also kept a note of the top actors. This was also an interesting finding. I think before, I mean, now it feels expected how we've seen the manosphere progress. But at the time, we weren't sure what kind of users would be uploading this content if we saw the content, that it could be a range of unknown actors and a huge array of kind of users. However, what it was the repetition of a same small number of well-known influencers. Not all the content was uploaded by the influencers themselves. Andrew Tate, who's number 1 on this list here, was actually banned from YouTube at the time. However, kind of micro users or smaller users were re-uploading this content on his behalf. So as we see here, we have a mix of manosphere actors, so Andrew Tate, Tristan Tate, Myron Gaines, but also a few reactionary right-wing actors. So we have Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and so on. However, for YouTube Shorts, it was very one note. I mean, Andrew Tate kind of dominated the ecosystem. And as Debbie said, these ecosystems move on incredibly fast, and who is kind of in the zeitgeist of popularity one day will move on. So at the time in 2023, Andrew Tate was extremely prevalent. I think this would look different if we redid it today. However, I think this is representative of just the kind of algorithmic politics behind behind this, rather than the actors themselves. And I think what this tells us here, this kind of prominence of Andrew Tate, is that YouTube Shorts is very kind of one note in its recommender systems. If you go on looking for manosphere content and look at some Andrew Tate, you'll just get inundated with Andrew Tate over and over again, and then a small amount of this other type of content. Then looking at this in comparison to TikTok. So overall, there was a lower amount of content overall on TikTok, with 34.7% of the recommended content being recommended containing these 4 coded themes. However, TikTok accounts were recommended a much more diverse range of toxic content, using diverse in a negative connotation here. So 21% of the content was manosphere content, and 13.6% of the content was reactionary right-wing content. And this fits into what we know about the TikTok algorithm. I mean, one of the reasons that we have to carry out research like this is that the recommender algorithms of major social media companies operate in a black box model, meaning that we don't know exactly how they operate. And this is kind of a closely guarded um, secret of the social media companies, if they even know themselves the exact formulas that kind of drive these things as they get tweaked over time. However, one thing we do know about TikTok is that it runs on a kind of overlapping spheres of interest model. So this means if you're someone who goes on TikTok looking at gardening videos, the algorithm will kind of be like, oh, people who regularly seek out gardening videos look at cooking videos quite often. So it will start kind of suggesting you cooking videos to see if you're also interested in that. And how that applies in this context is that TikTok ascertains that if a user is interested in kind of content like video games and gym tips, it'll be interested in kind of manosphere content. And from there, we'll associate that with, well, if you're interested in that kind of content, you're probably interested in reactionary right-wing content as well. So one of the interesting things is, despite the difference in the user or the diversity of content, the hashtags were very, very similar. I mean, this is almost the exact same as the ones for YouTube Shorts, with again this prominence of motivation, mindset, and kind of success, money, and this dominance of this kind of alpha masculinity, self-help guru type content. There was a lot of images of kind of men working out or women over cars with these kind of voiceovers of Andrew Tate and such, kind of giving these advice about how to be a correct man, which of course were endorsing things like emotional stoicism, dominance over women, and such. Again, the TikTok, the actors here are extremely similar again to those on YouTube, with Andrew Tate again being very central. And then again, reactionary right-wing actors. And as Debbie said, the prominence of American content to these spaces and American political content. These phones were set up in Ireland with their location available to the platforms. And when we were first going through the platforms without kind of prompting anything, the content was specific. But once it went into these ecosystems, it was dominated by UK, but particularly American content. And you can see that here with Trump being the third most popular actor. I'm here. And we have a breakdown as well. See, Andrew Tate was first, but again, it wasn't quite as dominated by this type of content. Yes, so just briefly going through what this content looked like. These are screenshots from our data set. We have hours and hours of this videos, which was a joy to watch. But just to give kind of an idea of what this looked like, again, as I said, the prominence of alpha masculinity or hyper masculine content was rife. It was almost the dominant theme here, with this kind of self-improvement, monetized model of the guru kind of coaching men and boys into how to become an ideal man. And this centered around a lot of what Debbie pointed out there, that we're hearing from young men about a man should be the breadwinner, dominant, and kind of imagining themselves as this kind of this patriarchal figure. Of course, there was a lot of sexism and misogyny. We see here a clip that says women don't deserve jobs, men and women can't be friends, kind of like stoking this kind of culture war, gender wars narrative. A lot of anti-feminism. So here we say modern women want to be victims, a high prevalence of discourse around feminism having gone too far, there was a lot of kind of podcast style clips as well, which people might be familiar with, where they would bring women on, quite young women, often OnlyFans performers, and kind of badger them and try and get them to defend live on air kind of feminism, and if they give anything imperfectly, kind of using this as a way to kind of mock them. We also saw, as I said, a lot of reactionary right and far right content. Interestingly, at the time, this was all focused around gender, anti-LGBT, and particularly anti-trans narratives, which were and are obviously particularly popular within these ecosystems at the moment, as they have quite like a strong pull in the attention economy. We wonder now, there's been quite a rise in far right content in Ireland around race and ethnicity, and I wonder if this was carried out now, whether that would have been more prevalent. There was also quite a lot of conspiracy content, again, around kind of ideas around grooming and kind of large scale kind of conspiracies around gender and trans ideology. Interestingly, there was also quite a lot of anti-education narratives, so promoting the idea that school was a waste of time, that education was a waste of time, and that in this world where only making money was the optimal way of being a man, that you shouldn't go to school and seek an education, that you should become an entrepreneur, obviously being used as a way to finance the courses and to push men and boys to the courses that were for sale by these influencers. So just go through a quick summary of the findings before I'll move on to some of the recommendations that we closed our report with. All of the accounts, both those who sought out manosphere content or sought out generic content, were fed manosphere or reactionary right-wing content. And this happened within 23 minutes for every phone, but the earliest being within 2 minutes. And once an account showed interest in watching this sort of content, the amount rapidly increased. And while we were only originally kind of going into this experiment expecting to see manosphere content, many of the phones were shown reactionary right-wing content, particularly prevalently on TikTok, and that this content was particularly focused on anti-feminism and anti-LGBT content. And a major finding from the study, which Debbie has talked about, is this dominance of influencer-centered content, and this kind of algorithmically fueled monetized model in which these influencers are kind of as a economic model creating this type of content to produce en masse. And this was all published in a report that we published with DCU Anti-Bullying Centre in 2024. I'm gonna plug. This is it right here. And you can find it on the DCU Anti-Bullying Centre website for more details. We go through our methodology and findings in more detail. And we also end the report with recommendations for social media companies, schools, teachers, parents, and guardians. But here I'll just go quickly through some of our recommendations, particularly focused, I think, at the social media platforms, because of course this is where these are profit-led infrastructures that are creating money off this type of content. So this is kind of where the onus is and should lie. So our recommendations are that the algorithmic architectures of social media platforms need radical rethinking to avoid promoting harmful content to young people. However, this is a battle within the techno-capitalist landscape of big tech, and obviously the social media companies are profit-driven, and therefore will kind of, unless forced, will not cut back on what is a very lucrative social media model. As Debbie said, this kind of bro-oligarchy model, which is increasingly being run by a select group of men who have pretty similar ideologies to this, I would say. So yeah. Also, rethinking moderation practices. This was something that we went in to talk to TikTok and YouTube after this. And one of the things that we were very interested in from our finding was, as Debbie said, a lot of this content is borderline. A lot of it would not meet standards for banning under content moderation policy, because things like anti-feminism, promoting kind of traditional masculinity, again, they're not hate speech and so on. But what we were interested in stressing to social media companies was that, yes, the content is borderline, but if it's being it's the organization of the content. If it's being mass recommended into the feeds of young people over and over again, it can have a cumulative effect. And that instead of having content-specific moderation focus, there needs to be a focus on the overall kind of algorithmic landscape and organization of this content. And based on this, safety by design principles should be embedded in product development. And this involves collaboration with diverse experts in gender-based abuse. Oh, also on the last point, moving beyond the kind of ban of individual users as a way of combating this. As we said, we carried out this project at a time when Andrew Tate was banned from both platforms, and yet his content was the most popular on both platforms. So obviously banning individual users doesn't work when it's being re-uploaded by smaller accounts en masse. We also stated that social media companies should publish their content moderating decision-making criteria, and in line with the Digital Services Act, should provide researchers with transparent details of algorithmic designs and access to data. So we don't have to do these kind of sock puppet accounts, that we can do larger scale research. And then from a kind of civic social perspective, we recommend increased funding, education in critical media literacy and gender and sexuality education, so that young people who are facing this kind of content en masse feel equipped to be critical and question this kind of content. So yeah, I think that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that very intriguing and interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I see that we already have 3 questions, and I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Kate Seaman, who will moderate the questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was a really fascinating presentation. I'm just going to jump straight into the questions because we already have so many from our participants. So the first comes from Dennis McGregor, who asked, is there any evidence-based practices that show effective strategies to shift away from the toxic masculinity in collaboration with both men and women, and also horrifying how the role of AI has become a major tool to facilitate violence against women?
I could take that if you like. Yeah, there are loads of different kinds of aspects to this, so it has to be tackled from loads of different angles. There's no one solution. There's no silver bullet solution to this because it's so societal. Because, the algorithms are just the pull factor, but we have to look at all the push factors, and the push factors are societal. And we have to also look at them in the context of the current poly crisis, and what is actually happening to boys and men. And so we're seeing increasingly young people generally exhibiting high levels of anxiety about their financial future, even if they're not particularly consciously concerned about climate justice, there is a kind of an ambient hum of concern, I think, that pervades all of our lives about, where we're going with the climate. Boys are still experiencing a lack of meaningful connection in their friendships. They're still telling us that they can't talk to one another about feelings, emotions, fears, vulnerability. They can't express vulnerability, and I think this is key in many ways. That they may be in a friend group, but it's based on a kind of laddish banter culture, and everybody has to keep the mood up. So this is a major problem. They may also have, dysfunctional dynamics going on in their family lives. They may lack uh, meaningful role models, whether male or female or whatever gender in their lives. So all of these factors um, are playing a role very often as well in this. So we have to address it from that kind of social perspective. And that's educational, that's holding the tech companies to account, that's increasing critical digital literacy. But it's also, I think, we need to think more deeply about what's happening to young people when children start to self-segregate by gender because of societal pressure. It becomes much easier then to tell boys all women are like that, a key message of the manosphere. It becomes much easier to say to them, girls are like this, girls are like that, because they're not having much to do with girls. They don't have any girlfriends anymore, friends who are girls. So that segregation, that isolation, makes them particularly vulnerable to this messaging. So all of these things we have to tackle in multiple different ways, I think.
Thank you. So I think that leads nicely into one of the next questions about the extent that you think the success of this content is driven by the platform algorithms versus what you've mentioned there, the broader cultural factors like male insecurity, economic and political anxiety, or mental health issues.
Yeah, I think it depends on various different cases. In some cases, it's going to be peer pressure, the algorithm. In other cases, it'll be a push factor that's more prevalent in that person's life. The peer culture is really important. The performativity of consuming this among your peers is very important. You may have actually no interest in it. You'll find among a peer group, there's a couple of guys who are really deeply invested in the ideas. You'll find others are just kind of rehearsing a lot of the rhetoric, but they're not actually invested. They've no real idea what the politics is about. So there's varying levels, I suppose, of engagement going on all the time.
Yeah, I might jump in there as well. I think one of the things that we're mindful in this research is not kind of being kind of techno-determinists, that this content is going into the feeds of young people and they're kind of uncritically taking it up. Some young people might be very critical of this, might disengage from it, but I think what the algorithms do is it kind of amplifies our broader structural kind of cultures of misogyny and patriarchy. And then the more this is kind of amplified into the field of the social media fields of young people, especially if young people aren't getting kind of enough critical digital literacy or sex and relationship education, it's more likely that it will be taken up by some people. So it's not that every young person will take it up, but that the algorithmic amplification widens the chances of this, and as we're seeing, does kind of amplify the harms of this kind of content.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Max Neville, and he asks, what is the primary hook that makes the content so popular? Is it that the algorithm is now a train, so to speak, that even the social media companies can't stop? And then tied into that, do you have a recommendation in relation to social media being banned for children under 18, which I know some countries have been talking about?
I think the primary hook in most cases is it's filling some desire either for connection, for community, or for peer approval. So it has a kind of a sociocultural capital. But it's always performing some kind of function or filling some kind of void, or it's making sense of a very complicated world very often in very, very simple ways. And that's very attractive when the world is so complex. Nobody wants to talk about neoliberal capitalism and the erosion of the social safety net to a bunch of 15-year-olds. They don't want to hear it either. And they want to believe that if you get up at 6 a.m. every day and have a cold shower and work hard, you're going to get rich. And it's very difficult to talk about global poverty then, because this is the world. It's the microcosm of, the feed and your own world. But they're interesting conversations and they need to be had, yeah. On the social media ban, I think Ireland, generally speaking, is not going to go down that route. We're not in favor of it. We are in a very unique position that a lot of the tech companies are headquartered here in Dublin. Our government, there's good reasons and bad reasons for this. They're providing a lot of jobs. We are a huge technological hub, so there's very obvious financial reasons for the government wanting to keep them here. But the reason from people like us who work in this space is that, number one, there's no evidence that a ban will be effective. There'll be too many workarounds. Nobody knows how it can actually be enforced. It's not even specified which platforms we're talking about. People would just move to new platforms, and the evidence from Australia so far is that it's not working, and that a lot of teenagers are finding it really problematic for various reasons. So it doesn't seem to be working. What you're doing is you're kind of suspending the need to teach critical digital literacy, and that is essential. What you're also doing, I think, even more importantly, is letting the tech companies off the hook. So this gives them a free pass. They don't have to implement safety by design or ethics by design. It's not their problem anymore. And it's putting the onus or the responsibility back onto parents who are already, super stressed and worried about this. So I think it's responsibilizing all the wrong people. We need to keep up the pressure on the tech companies, is my bottom line anyway.
Yeah, and just to around the hook question as well there, I think Debbie did a really good explanation from the user, but then also from the algorithmic point of view. I think, the algorithm will always prioritize engagement. The most salacious, the most shocking, the most emotionally charged content is that which gets eyes on it and therefore will be prioritized in the algorithm. And yeah, just echoing about not in favor of a social media ban. I think it's important that this is the media landscape of a lot of young people, but not all of young people. And young people also seek out digital media for a lot of other reasons. And we live digitally now, so young people are going to be exposed to the media online. And we need to make sure that from lobbying the social media companies that we create a safe environment for them, and also that they're educated with critical digital literacy skills, that when they're not just thrown online then at 18 and expected, because also adults are also impacted and facing the same consequences kind of content. It's not just young people. Yeah,
it's worth noting as well, because we're living in very different spaces at the moment, and there is a kind of a shift, I think, recently in Ireland. Grok was probably the thing that tipped people over the edge here. It was just a kind of catalyst or the last straw in many ways. But there is now, I think, a shift in public and even political opinion, which is people are starting conversations about building European tech and becoming less dependent on American technology. And that has started. There are projects and there are new platforms and apps being developed. There's also quite a big campaign to turn the algorithms off by default, and just a kind of a louder voice, I think, in terms of speaking up to the tech companies. Now we know that we're not naive. We know how enormous and powerful they are and how complicated this is politically. But I think public opinion is shifting towards critique of the tech companies in an interesting way. And there's talk of, let's look under the hood of ChatGPT and OpenAI. Let's look at their finances. In fact, these companies are in massive amounts of debt. And there was an article in The Guardian just last week saying that OpenAI is one successful boycott away from total collapse. And we shouldn't think that they are unconquerable and that, they're all powerful. A lot of them are probably teetering on the brink of, financial ruin, and that, maybe boycott is one successful route we can go. So there's a lot of movement here to boycott Spotify, to boycott ChatGPT. This has started up. I don't know if that's the case in the US, but we're seeing a huge amount of that on social media. We're also seeing, I think this is really interesting, and this has only happened relatively recently, is increasing numbers of male pro-feminist anti-manosphere accounts, really good accounts that are kind of full-time dedicated to debunking and discrediting the manosphere in really interesting ways, but also in providing kind of alternative, positive visions of masculinity and discussions about masculinity that are very inspiring. And there's like hundreds of these accounts now. So I think that's a really positive change, not just men, but to see that men are kind of standing up to the plate and tackling the manosphere and, being very vocal, pretty much full-time allies, I suppose, is heartening. So, we don't want to end on a note of despair, because that's what they want. They
Yeah.
want to despair and to feel overwhelmed. So we can't do that.
Yeah, to
Absolutely
back up
not.
Debbie's point there about the accounts, I'm currently doing another research project on the manosphere on TikTok, and now when I search up things like red pill, it'll be a mix of red pill but also counter red pill. So if you search the hashtag red pill now on TikTok, some of the most viewed videos will be men or women dispelling the red pill. That is becoming much more prominent in these spheres as well. So I think, and because of the amount of attention this kind of content got, there was then an upsurge in people challenging it. So yeah, hopeful note.
We always appreciate a hopeful note. So the
Absolutely.
next question comes from Huanzu, who says, very interesting study. Thanks. It seems that most videos are negative in attitude, although you've said a little bit more about some positive ones there. For accounts that never actively search for any content, are the videos promoting the manosphere also highly likely? And what is the reason? And then connected to that, if you change the account role to be female, what kind of videos will the platform suggest?
For accounts that didn't seek out any content, no, they were not suggesting any manosphere. So we had a control account for each phone that just kind of went through without searching anything ever, and they were not recommended manosphere content. I think that's because, with the YouTube algorithm or TikTok algorithm is not just designed to promote manosphere content to anyone. It's doing kind of a user and content behavior the algorithm is very smart, and it gears to the kind of interests and demographics of the user. I mean, I'm on TikTok and I get lovely feminist content all day, and because that's the kind of content and user that I've portrayed myself as. So you have to kind of, what we were kind of looking at, and the thing that we were drawing attention to was that the algorithm even just sees young boy interested in kind of video games and gym tips, and that's enough to send it into that ecosystem. But if you're just going as a regular user, or a young boy who's looking at completely different types of content, if you're a young boy who likes knitting content and feminism, it's not going to show you manosphere content. But we're kind of showing how the kind of gateways into this can be quite innocuous. And then for the question about being a woman, it's very interesting. I mean, you can't change your gender on your account. I think halfway through would have to be another experiment. I mean, we would love to do this experiment on bigger scales with different types of users. However, I know that the GEMS lab in Canada, in Northwestern University, I was on a call with them recently, and they want to do a version of this research looking at women's content and kind of looking to see if any kind of trad wife, traditional femininity content will be recommended. So I think there is going to be more research in this space coming up, especially because I do think we are seeing a lot of more in the last year or two progressive gender content now being sold to women and repackaged for women, kind of divine femininity, trad wife, soft life kind of content that's kind of repackaging it for a female audience. So we don't have evidence right now, but I think that it's going to be coming. It's a very interesting question, I think.
Yeah, and they're telling us that they're getting trad wife content, because we did a workshop in a co-educational that's mixed gender, school last week, and all of the girls were getting recommended tradwife content. And a lot of just, more inane, innocuous domesticity type content. And when we said to the boys this week in an all boys school, do you ever get tradwife content? They didn't know what tradwife was. This is how polarized and divisive it is. And I've seen this. I went to Safer Internet Day in Dublin the week before last, and on the tram on the way in, I was sitting beside I'd say 15, 16-year-old guy, and his feed was just constant fitness, manosphere adjacent kind of content. A bit of football thrown in, but mostly just influencer, all this kind of lifestyle coach stuff, but very masculinity oriented. And there was no let up in that, really, the whole journey in, which is like nearly half an hour. And on the way home, I was standing on the tram behind a 15-year-old girl, 15, 16-year-old girl, and all her content was makeovers, makeup, clothes, kind of DIY makeovers, and then tradwife content without, again, without any kind of variation for the whole journey home. So it was a very interesting experience, going to Safer Internet Day, talking about this kind of gender polarization, and that for me, that experience was sandwiched between these really extreme examples. But I think, we're seeing more and more of that, unless you interrupt the algorithm yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of it like in the same way that a lot of the content for men is now becoming more kind of covert, as Debbie said, like not explicit. I think for women it is as well. It's often kind of now repackaged as kind of liberal feminist content. That actually the feminist thing to do is to get him to pay and be a stay-at-home girlfriend and to live a soft life and all these things that are actually in the current gender political kind of context we live in. It's kind of just reselling traditional gender norms back to women as this kind of ideal, which then benefits kind of conservative gender or conservative politics in general. So yeah, I think it's becoming more covert as well for both genders.
So that fits well with a question from Jessica Herzog, who asks, are there any existing resources of guidance on resetting or hacking your algorithm, or how you'd suggest a young male be able to reset theirs to not be fed this content?
I mean, the main thing is not to engage, not to like it and not to watch it. But you can also, there are settings where you can say, don't show me this type of content, or I don't want to see any more of this kind of content in your settings, depending on which platform you're on. I know there is an Instagram anyway. I don't
And you
want
can
to
reset, and you can reset your algorithm for scratch if you would like to completely start over again. I think this is also why the critical digital media literacy part is so crucial, because a lot of young people we talk to, because we talk to people who probably would have a bit more access to information about algorithms, they're become aware of the role of algorithms, and they'll tell you that they know the algorithm is promoting the content. So the more that they're aware, and the more they're aware that what the social media landscape they're in is algorithmically fueled, the more likely they are to make decisions that it isn't random what they're getting. And like there's dislike buttons, there's searching out different kind of content, resetting. So yeah, I think giving these tools are embedded in the social media algorithm and the platforms because of pressure on them. But giving the young people the information that's there and how to use it is really beneficial.
Thank you. And then I think that fits with a question from Alexandra Stewart, who asks, considering who owns these platforms and how, as you have mentioned, they're clearly aligned with the Trump government, are these bad algorithm glitches, or is it the system working as it should, as it's been designed to?
Whoa. Yeah, this is such a massive question. It is part of what's his name? Corey, is it Doctorow? Calls the enshittification of the internet, which is, that the internet, social media platforms, not just social media, all of our apps are becoming less and less useful. They're becoming less and less functional in the race to get new products to market first, and also, to save money, basically. That the products are becoming kind of worse and worse. How that becomes politically then hijacked is it's easier to distract people. I mean, the transition, the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk is a key example of enshittification, right? You had this amazing platform where, there was a lot of very interesting and open debate. And when it became X, we see, an absolute downturn, polarization, all the algorithms change, loads of people are sacked, there's no safety anymore. That is, a classic case of the enshittification of the internet. And what we see then is huge political ramifications immediately. This serves the broligarchy extremely well. Everyone is distracted. Everyone is in conflict. And this is what you need, is to keep attention away from what the new techno-feudalist ruling class are doing, which is, widening the gap between rich and poor and creating modern forms of slavery at global scale. So yeah, is the short answer. It's not a glitch, it's by design.
Thank you. And so I want to come back to a question about the digital media literacy that you were talking about with the students, but also something you mentioned about their awareness now, or an increasing awareness that they're being fed this information, and how they're responding to that awareness. And has that changed, or do you see a change in how they're then interacting with that content? Or are they still kind of interacting in the same ways?
I think it depends on
it depends on how much critical digital literacy, consent education they've had. You will see in schools where there's a very active whole school policy on this, especially schools where they teach philosophy, very different engagements and levels of critical awareness than other schools where you see it just kind of like, this is just the way it is. They haven't really given it much thought. I was trying to make this connection for them yesterday. What do you think if you're getting all of this like very conservative, reactionary kind of content in your feed all day? And even if you think it doesn't affect you, what about these new statistics which show that your generation is for the first time more conservative and more reactionary than older generations? Does that not shock you? And that kind of did shock them. That made them think a bit. There was silence for a while, while they were kind of joining up those dots. But yeah, I mean, it just involves so much effort on the part of the school, and we don't have the infrastructure. You don't have dedicated training for teachers necessarily in this space. And it has to be a whole school approach, really, rather than just teaching critical digital literacy as a separate module. It has to be really integrated across the curriculum, but that means a kind of massive curricular overhaul and a reframing, really, of your pedagogical principles in many ways to encourage that level of critical response. I think we kind of know that to a large extent, that's not what the second level school system is for. That's not really the function it serves, is to make kids like really critical of systems of power in society. There's a certain element of that, but I think secondary school education performs a different societal function than university, largely. So, these are big questions about the role of education, I suppose. But some schools have really adopted this, in a very serious way. But it takes political will, it takes investment, and it needs to be rolled out at national level. And that kind of change, I don't know the system in the US, but, with the Department of Education here, the pace.
Yeah, and the US, I know this is
it's very slow.
Yeah, in the US right now with the taxation.
I think your internet has has gone down, Catherine.
Oh,
I
me?
think
Am I back?
we can hear you, but you're frozen. Oh, you're back.
You're back.
Okay, it's fine. We can go to the next question. It's not.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. From Lottie Van Apperen, who says, maybe the large-scale trend is too recent for this, but is there anything known about how vulnerability for an engagement with this content changes over time for an individual? I've heard some personal stories of men who were eventually disenchanted with the content because aiming for this lifestyle cannot live up to expectations. Do people often experience this as a phase, or does it more likely affect one's beliefs for the long term?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. A lot of men we're speaking to in the project that I mentioned with the Australian colleagues, we're interviewing Irish and Australian men who either are still engaged, but most of them are disengaged, but were formerly involved in manosphere spaces and have come out of them. And it's exactly that. They become disenchanted. They realize that it's a kind of, there's a circular logic to this, or that it's a bunch of lies, and that these guys are all hustlers and grifters, and that their promises are empty, etc. And very often it's because they have some kind of an intimacy breakthrough and they realize that, no, not all women are like this. Or in fact, no matter how hard I work, I'm not going to become a millionaire. These, this kind of realization dawns when they become a bit more mature, I suppose, or get a bit more life experience. So yeah, and I think that is also true of the incel community, which is more kind of extreme and subcultural. That it's quite an adolescent community in some ways, and that people do grow out of it as well. Not all of them, but there is a sense that this is a phase, but this constant stream of people who are engaging with it.
Yeah, I think also, like, to bring it back to the kind of original manosphere, I remember in Rachel O'Neill's work on Pickup Artist, she discussed how at first this content kind of, she interviewed people who were in the pickup artist movement for years, and at first the kind of feeling was very positive because you're getting this kind of advice and self-improvement and you're kind of dedicating yourself to this kind of, so initially it feels like a great thing that you found a sense of purpose, but then when she interviewed them down the line in several years, the kind of feelings of hopelessness, the mental health problems, the alcohol had all kind of returned. It hadn't given them what they wanted, and it had kind of, if anything, kind of had a rebound effect that they were kind of more lost than ever. So I think that thing of, it's like any kind of self-improvement, it does initially give this kind of sense of optimism, especially as Debbie said, in a unsure, anxious times we live in. But then when it doesn't fulfill these promises and they find themselves kind of I mean, hopefully that would lead to a wake up. Maybe for some people it causes a more of a reactionary, but I do think maybe there's kind of a rebounding effect there.
Thank you both so much. I'm afraid we are out of time. I'm going to hand back over to Hoda now to close us up, but we very much appreciate your time and your ongoing research.
Thank you, Kate. And again, I want to thank both of you, Professor Ging and Dr. Baker. Really a very important topic today, and much to think about. You've given us so much information, and especially in relation to parents who are concerned about their children in this regard. And I'm hoping that that more and more people will look at your research and learn from what you're doing to enlighten us about this very important topic. Thank you. We are delighted to have had you and appreciate your being with us today. And I want to just, yes, thank you. I want to just remind our audience about our next virtual event, which is March 25th. And it features Professor Patricia Owens from the University of Oxford. She is Professor of International Relations. Her topic is Erased, a History of International Thought Without Men. I think this will be a very interesting lecture, telling us what international thought would look like if women had a greater role in it. So during this month, when we are celebrating women, I think these are both today's presentation and the next one on March 25th will be very important. So we hope you will join us on March 25th and RSVP for the program. Thank you again until we see you next time. Bye-bye.